Hey, what's going on, everybody? Well, if you're considering an LPVO alternative, here's one to look at. The Primary Arms MD-25 ACSS with the Juliet 4 magnifier. To see what this combo brings to the table, we're going to look at it right now. So let's go.
Yippee-ki-yay, motherfucker.
Glass and reticle. So in terms of glass quality, the glass looks really clear to me. I didn't really notice any really big distortion or kind of edge warpiness. However, I think if you notice for close targets, you can see if you look toward the periphery that it looks a little bit warpy. But I think in practical terms, it's okay because at that distance, you're usually shooting pretty fast anyway, so you won't really notice it. Now, once you power on the sight, let's talk about reticle brightness. It's got 11 total brightness settings, with the first two being night vision, NV. And as you can tell, that at max brightness, this is more than enough lighting for this high noon desert lighting conditions. And the steps between those brightness settings are fine enough to where even if you're in shade, you can find the right setting just for you. And in terms of color cast or any bluish tint, I didn't see any. We didn't see any red glare when the sun was at our backs, or any strange orbs or light fragments when we were shooting into the sun for dawn and dusk type conditions. Now, in terms of field of view, that typically doesn't come into place since this is a red dot. However, I will say this, the controls on this dot are pretty large, especially the brightness control on the left-hand side. So it's similar to what an Aimpoint Comp M4 would be like, in that you can kind of see those controls in your field of view. It doesn't melt away like it does with EOTech, so take that into consideration. Now, speaking of field of view, one of the distinguishing features of this sight is this large 25mm objective lens. That is the same size as the Trijicon MRO. And you can see how much larger it is when you stack it up to like a micro sight, like a Romeo 5. Now, that large objective lens does come into play, especially when you're in a weird shooting position or something like that. Sometimes it can be hard to find the dot with a micro sight, but with a large objective like this, it makes it really easy to do. So when it comes to this reticle, it combines both elements of CQB and long-range shooting. The CQB elements include the 65 MOA ring, so just like in EOTech, for fast acquisition and tracking the sight and recoil. And within that ring, you'll see the chevron. Now, I think a chevron is about 4 MOA across, so for close shooting, you just splash that chevron any center of mass, and you'll get a good combat effective hit. And if you have targets within 50 to 100 yards, you use the tip of the chevron for that type of long distance shooting. But for really long distance shooting, that's where the BDC comes into play. And we'll talk about that more when we talk about long range reticle. Okay, so far this sight's looking really good as far as reticle and glass, so no big drawback so far. The only limitation I've seen is, unfortunately, it's not Hall sun, so you can't change your reticle, and that would have been really nice if you could. So now we're gonna back up to the externals, and we're gonna talk about controls in the next section coming up. Controls and mounting. So when it comes to controls, we'll talk about the adjustment turrets first. Now, if you use the Aimpoint T1, these turrets are going to be really familiar to you. On each of the end caps, you'll find a little protruded nub that fits exactly into the recess on each of those turrets for zeroing. And as far as adjustments, each of those clicks is 0.5 MOA. So if you're zeroing at 50 yards, each click is about 1/4 inch. And as I mentioned earlier, these clicks feel a little bit tinny, so they're not for dialing or return to zero. So once you zero this optic, put the caps back on and just shoot with it. Don't touch them again. And on the left side, you'll find an illumination knob. Now, as mentioned earlier, it has 11 brightness settings, with the first two being night vision. I like that the first two night vision settings are actually labeled. That's really good thinking. Now, one note about that brightness control is, out of the box, that thing is pretty stiff to turn. It may loosen up over time, but as you turn it, you're gonna like you're gonna think, oh, okay, this thing needs more force than I think it needs. And there's no clicks in between them, so you just feel a little bit of pressure change, and that's when the actual setting will stick. And just remember, there is no off position in between. It's not an LPVO, so to actually turn the sight off, you do have to turn it off. There is no shake awake either, so remember, you have to turn it off. By the way, the manual said this reticle runs off of battery for 12,000 hours on a single 2032, so that's around 16 months or so, so just add a calendar reminder to change that battery. Now, when it comes to mounting, this sight has a lot of options. If you're mounting an AK or a shotgun, you're gonna wanna use the low base mount. If you want to mount an AR, you want absolute co-witness, you're gonna wanna use the standard riser. Now, if you want lower 1/3 co-witness, you're gonna have to experiment with either the thin or thick riser in addition to the standard riser. So when you're using a magnifier, you do have to think about elevation heights and matching them between the magnifier and the red dot. Here we're using the SIG Juliet 4 magnifier, so to get these two to match, we use the thickest spacer on both, and that seemed to work out just fine. One last note is this sight is not QD, so basically it just comes with the Torx mount. So once you put that on the rail and you screw those in, that sight stays as is. So if you want QD, this sight is compatible with other micro mounts. So check that out if you need that QD capability. So one more thing about its exterior that you'll notice is its weight. So it comes in at about 6.5 ounces, so that's really close to the Trichcon MRO. But if you pair it with the SIG Juliet, you're gonna bring it to the total about 19 total ounces. So you're getting close to LPVO weight. Now that's something to consider, but just remember that you're likely considering this option if you want the flexibility of a red dot, plus you want to shoot a little bit of long distance. Speaking of which, we're gonna talk about long distance in the next section coming up. Long range reticle. Okay, now that we've seen how this glass does at short range, we'll talk about this combo now at long range. Now, I say combo because we're pairing this with the SIG Juliet 4 magnifier, which you saw in the earlier video with the SIG AT. I'll link it if you haven't seen it. Now, there aren't very many 4X magnifiers out there. The reason why we like this one is it's got a good QD mount, it's got good centering controls, and it's got good eye relief and good glass quality. And it's only slightly heavier than the Holosun 3x magnifier. So once you get the magnifier behind it, I think it looks good under magnification. It doesn't have any color cast like you saw with the previous 8T, so it looks clear. Although the BDC dots are slightly bigger than the 8T, so it would have been nice if they're a little bit sharper and smaller. Now for those BDC dots, the manual does have some basic drop data for a few different calibers, and it also has some ranging data if you want to use the center chevron for some ranging. But as you know from watching this channel, we work with actual data and actual drops, and for that we'll need to use Strelic. So as far as ammo, we'll be shooting Impact Ammo's 55 grain bullet, and since we're using a 13.9 Criterion barrel, our ammo velocity is 28.35. And here we're zeroing for 100 yards for simplicity, but feel free to experiment, as 50 yards should work out just fine as well. Please note that in Strelic, the MD-25 is not listed, so you need to look for the ACSS micro dot. Okay, so now that we have our holds, the next step is we need to test it on our known distance range. We'll be shooting reduced size dipsticks from 200 to 400 yards. We'll shoot it twice and correct for misses if need be. Max will be our shooter, so take it away, Max.
All right, Primary Arms MD-25. So with 100 yard zero, we should be pretty much top of the chevron at 200, just a bit low. Hit. 300, bottom of the chevron. Hit. And then 400. We're gonna be between the first and second dot. Hit. Okay, 200, top of the chevron. Hit. 300, basically bottom of the chevron. Hit. Then 400 will be something like holding the first dot high. Might be off a little left or right. Let's try right. Hit.
All right, fellas, so what's the final verdict on this Primary Arms MD-25 ACSS? So this isn't the first time we've done a red dot and magnifier combo in this channel. We did it previously several years ago with the Holosun 503G, the smaller version of this dot. I'll link to it if you haven't seen that video. And as mentioned earlier, we did it with the battle tank of an optic, the SIG 8T. So along that spectrum, I think this side, the MD-25, fits perfectly in that it's larger than the 503G in that it's got a bigger window size, and it's still smaller and lighter than the SIG 8T. And most importantly, it's cheaper as well. And as you saw during the long range section, it can do the job just fine. Just know that compared to an LPVO, the optical performance of a magnifier does not match up side by side. The magnifier has a smaller field of view, it doesn't have as good light gathering capabilities, and it's just not as clear. However, as long as you accept those limitations and your use case is such that you're going to be using mostly CQB type shooting, then I think this combo will do a great job for that. And that's my final verdict. Hopefully it helps. And if you found this video useful, please give it a like, comment, and share so this small channel can keep growing. And if you saw any equipment you're interested in, I'll leave a link in the description below. Thanks for joining us again. I'll see you again next time.